Welcome to the next chapter.
Welcome, everyone, to the next chapter, the podcast where expert and curious minds are talking about AI applications in the context of media and content. But for today, we have a special one, and a rather serious one, which is going to be about AI safety and ethics. And I think we can all agree that it's something that touches every sort of application we can think about and has serious implications on our future as humanity. And I'm very, very happy to be joined today by Calum Mackenzie, the Director of AI Strategy here at CHAPTR, and by Minesh Tanna, who is a partner and the Global AI Lead for the international law firm at Simmons Simmons. Hello, everyone. How are you doing? And welcome.
Hi.
Hi. Very, very happy to have you here because, myself, and I think a lot of others have been enjoying the fun stuff about playing with different AI tools and different applications, but you've been since the beginning on the dark side of the moon and trying to make sure that we do things the right way.
Are you saying, Dana, that the safety and ethics is not the fun stuff?
It depends on how you look at it, right? I'm sure now in this podcast we're going to find out how fun it actually is. But before we jump in, please, I'd like to, and for our audience as well, to learn a little bit about yourselves. So, Minesh, please tell us a little bit about your background.
Thanks, Dennis. Well, I'm a lawyer by background. I've been specializing in disputes for the last 10 years or so, and principally technology disputes. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been focused on AI, purely stemming from personal interest and passion, but also because I really do think it's a form of autonomous technology, something we haven't encountered before, and it's got the capacity to question fundamental legal principles. For example, we typically, in legal analysis, judge humans on things that they have done or not done, and we have concepts like causation and concepts of reasonableness when we judge standards, and I think AI really starts to question that and makes us revisit fundamental principles of legal analysis. So that's really what sparked my interest. And I work a lot in AI at the moment, the intersection of AI and law and ethics and regulation, advising clients and doing talks and writing about similar issues. So thanks for having me and looking forward to a good discussion.
Couldn't have a better person on the podcast. Thank you for the intro. Callum, please. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Hi, everyone. So I started my career in management consulting and then spent a bunch of time in industry, in corporates like Amazon and BT, and then moved back into consulting and got more and more curious about data and AI. So before joining CHAPTR, I worked for an AI organization, and that's when Minesh and I crossed paths, so we know each other well. And I've been at CHAPTR from the start, and in this role as Director of AI Strategy, I guess I'm lucky that I get to cover a wide range of things. And but it's essentially, we started this company, and I was involved with the founders from the start before generative AI really kicked off, which we'll come on to in this discussion. So that's just helping the organization think through all things in terms of safety, ethics, what type of organization do we want to be, how do we embrace these new technologies, and applying some of that experience I've got in the previous AI organization directly into this role.
And we are very, very lucky to have you. Thank you so much.
Stop it.
Okay, cool. Let's. I had to say it, but let's kick it off. And please, Callum, don't send me back to training for asking this question, because I'm doing it not just for myself, but for the broader audience. I think we should start with the real basics about defining what it is that we're talking about and what we're going to be discussing. So, please give us a definition of what safety and ethics means in the context of technology.
Sure.
Minesh, I'd love to start with you on this one.
Sure. I mean, you'll forgive me for looking at this slightly through a legal lens, given my background, but I think when I think of AI ethics or just ethics in general, it's actually less about the law and more broadly about doing the right thing. And I appreciate that sounds a bit nebulous, and there are obviously different conceptions around the world of what the right thing is. But I think broadly that's what I would say is captured by the term ethics. And I think safety goes hand in hand with that because I think it appeals more to the consequences of AI and technology not being used in the right way, in that it would be unsafe, it could cause harm, and we can come on to discuss the concept of harm because I think that's particularly interesting in the case of technology. We're probably not just talking about physical harm and financial harm. It's probably a deeper, more complex notion in this context. But that's broadly where I would pitch this. Ethics is about doing things and using things in the right way, and safety is about ensuring that there's no negative consequences arising out of the use.
Absolutely, thank you, Callum. I see that you're nodding, so you fully agree. Do you want to add anything on top of
Minesh
this
has
from the?
given a very succinct answer there, so I'll
Absolutely.
yeah, obviously agree. I think so labeling is an interesting one because responsible AI, trustworthy AI, safety, ethics, there's lots of kind of different terminology floating around, and it is a complex topic. And my job is to help us at CHAPTR just kind of think through what sort of culture do we want to be and how do we have the right conversations, which is sort of touches upon Minesh's point there, just doing the right thing. I think the relationship between human processes and data sets in any organization obviously has changed as technology has improved over time. And traditional software is deterministic, which means it's predictable and it executes fixed rules. And machine learning software is probabilistic, which means it draws inferences about the world based on the data that it sees. So there's a bunch of new considerations any organization has to work through to make sure we don't harm people and expose them to technologies that we don't really fully understand. And I think a nice analogy here is the design and build of a bridge. So engineers don't think about, they do think about safety as inherent to the design. So you don't add safety on afterwards. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about sort of design, build, and implementation of AI systems. And this is, Minesh used the language of sort of harm, and I think hazard is like another interesting word to use. So a child being exposed to disturbing content on a social media platform is a hazard. And then I quite like sort of breaking these hazards down into 4 ways. So the probability of the hazard occurring, the severity of that hazard, the vulnerability, i.e. how humans react to the content, and then the exposure, which is sort of how many people does it directly impact. So I think there's a sort of an alignment there that sort of Minesh and I are just trying to break that down, I guess, in simple terms with hopefully simple language, rather than focusing too much on what does safety and ethics actually mean, because every organization will interpret it differently.
And have its own different. Yes, please.
Sorry, I was just going to say, at the risk of throwing even more labels and language into this, I think trust is quite an important word to consider as well. And we've got to accept that AI is going to be with us, and we are going to be using it and be impacted by it. And so I think safety and ethics, and Callum mentioned the design point, which I think is key. This is not just about living in the current moment, a static point at which you look at AI and say, is it capable of causing harm? Is it being used in the right way? Is it safe? This is about preparing us as a society for many decades of AI use and adoption. And we have to be able to trust it from the outset in order for that to be a safe development and course of action. And I sometimes use the analogies of aeroplanes. Now, we all fly on planes, and I confess I don't really have much of an idea about how they fly and stay in the air, but I still trust them and I consider them to be safe. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. I was thinking about this. The first is that we have a track record of safety. So I know that planes have been in the air operating safely for decades. And the second part is regulation. I know that there's regulation underpinning aviation. So pilots are trained according to regulation. The planes, in terms of their technical standards, meet certain regulations. Now, we have neither of those things yet for AI. We don't have regulation in force, and we don't have the track record. So coming back to Callum's point about designing safety and ethics from the start, I think that's absolutely key, and it really emphasizes why these concepts are so important, particularly at the nascent stage of this technology.
Exactly, and thank you for. I really appreciate the parallel to the planes. It's also a thing that the Center for Humane Technology refers to as well when they're trying to pose for their ways of going about AI. And you both mentioned some things that I think lead quite nicely into my next question about harm and hazard and the stuff that people are being exposed to. And I'd like to look back, in the last 5 to 10 years around how this safety around AI, because we all know AI has been around, so we don't need to deep dive into that too much. But what are some observations that you had around how it has been approached? Because we, at the moment, and this is my opinion, I believe it mirrors others too, didn't really do the best job in terms of technology that came around, and the responsibilities that came around with it weren't really treated accordingly, and now we're in a very reactive rather than proactive state. I'd like to hear your opinions around this too, and the past 10 years when it comes to development. Whoever would like to start, Calum, I'll pass it to you because I see that pensive look.
Yeah. So I'm going to wind the clock back a little bit further than the last 5-10 years. I think it's AI safety is actually a field that has gone back decades, focused on reducing the risks of AI, and this kind of, if you do the reading around it, then it talks about up until 1950, it was fictional portrayals of malfunctioning robots, and then kind of between 1950 and 2000, it was scientists speculating about the dangers as the new technologies emerged. And then sort of between 2000 and 2012, that's when we saw the birth of AI safety organizations and then key funders of this, and starting to think, sort of be fearful of the implications, people like Peter Thiel and Jan Tarlin. And then sort of from 2013 onwards, it's become mainstream in kind of came into public conscious, I think, through books like Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom. And then there's sort of influential people like Elon Musk and Sam Altman and Bill Gates starting to have this conversation more and more about AI safety, and organizations like OpenAI being set up in 2016. And I think there's sort of a number of different ways that we could think about this in terms of if the question is which commercial organizations publish the most research in this area, then it's by far the leading two are Google/DeepMind and Microsoft/OpenAI. And just my sort of personal perspective in this space, based on my work, is, and this is how Minesh and I met, really. In my previous company, we used to think about it against 4 pillars, which is explainability, privacy, robustness, and fairness. And I worked with a real wide range of clients across banking, insurance, e-commerce, retail, private equity, legal tech. And our job there was to work with the research team that we had in the company to help through practically what these 4 pillars meant for the clients in terms of the data sets, the regulatory environment in their sector, and the sort of severity and impact of the use case. So that's sort of another way of saying it has moved from research labs into day-to-day real-world conversations with clients about, are you thinking about this? What are you actually doing about it? But it's been slow from what I can see. It definitely, in that kind of between 2019 and 2023, it's getting there, but I'm sure Minesh can help us out with why it's been slow and kind of what from a regulatory perspective, kind of how fast it's moving along.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, Minesh. What are your thoughts on this?
Well,
the
firstly,
the speed of development, so to say.
yeah. Well, I was going to say, firstly, Callum, what a fantastic summary and overview going back a few decades. That's great, and I agree with that. I think the first point to say is the concept of AI safety has been with us for so long as AI has been with us since the 1950s. People have been talking about it. There's been a lot of research, but coming on to the point that Callum mentioned just at the end there, what's actually being done? Why has it been slow? I think firstly that's right. And it's only now that we're really seeing the concept, the discussions turned into actual practical implemented steps in order to ensure safety, so actual tangible things that have been done. So to give an example, people have talked about transparency and explainability because, as Cal said, AI is probabilistic in its advanced forms. There's a certain amount of uncertainty as to how AI technologies are going to make decisions, and transparency and explainability are a way of mitigating that. So we understand the technology a bit better. But it's really only in the last few years that we've seen tangible measures put in place on a widespread scale to actually make sure that there's explainability. I've been involved in documents called explainability statements, but they haven't been around for very long, despite the fact that we've had the technology for a while. I think the other reason this has been a bit slow is, as Callum alluded to, a lack of mandatory regulation. Now, I think it's just the fact that a lot of organizations react in a different way once there's material regulation in place, which could result in a fine or some other sanction which could materially affect their business. And once that's in place, they will start to wake up and take active measures. And then finally, I think a point worth noting is that AI has obviously been the domain and in the realm of machine learning engineers, IT teams, more business-sided folk. And it's only really in the last few years that we've seen in large organizations in particular, compliance, risk, and legal teams really start to think about AI and their organization's use of AI. And it's typically through those teams and individuals that you start to see implementation of measures around safety, ethics, and in due course binding regulation. But now that we're in that era and now that we're in that phase, I expect to see a lot more tangible progress in that area.
Thank you so much. And it's also the fact that now applications are being rolled out at lightning speed that kind of makes us have to go into this taking action mode rather than focusing on spending time on research and the best approach. And Callum, you mentioned the 4 pillars that you were, doing your research against. Can you please remind me those again? Which they were?
Yeah, sure. So explainability, privacy, robustness, and fairness. And
Right.
I think this is I'll come on in a moment to how we're thinking about it in chapter, because the spoiler alert, we have more than 4 pillars. But I think it's once you actually unpick the sort of emerging regulatory and ethical frameworks, then it's about finding language that's right for your culture as an organization, and things, so transparency, explainability, these things they all actually do point to very similar disciplines, but it's down to how the organization interprets that and then turns it into real actions. And so those 4, I think, broadly cover very similar points to the 9 that I'm about to tell you about, but it's inevitably 9 sounds quite a lot, but at chapter we feel like we've kind of got it under control in terms of the actions that sit underneath those 9 areas, but it's an individual choice for that organization. So that's I'm sure Minesh will have an opinion on kind of how, from a regulatory perspective, like this should be kind of broken down in terms of, you mentioned compliance, Minesh. So how do you see it, Minesh, in terms of how organizations are sort of practically taking these emerging frameworks and applying them into something a bit more demonstrable.
Yeah, I'll come on to that in a second. I think you made a really astute point about how you characterize some of these principles or pillars, as you said in your previous organization, and the fact that the way you characterize them, the number and the labels you give to them is really a cultural thing. And I think that's absolutely right. And it got me thinking, I often put, for example, transparency and explainability together. But actually, there's potentially a significant difference in terms of what you're saying about the culture of your organization. If you talk about explainability, then you're effectively saying, can we understand and explain how our AI systems operate? Whereas if you focus on transparency, there may be a bit more focus on actually making your models more transparent in the first place, which may not actually be captured by the concept of explainability. Equally, if you go for fairness rather than non-discrimination, then you're capturing a wider set of principles and concepts than just non-discrimination. And then again, that has a big impact on culture and reflects the culture. So I think that's a really astute point you made. Coming on to how you implement this, well, with difficulty, I think we see so many frameworks that talk about these principles, and I'm sure the 9 that you have a chapter that you've discussed are all familiar ones. They're present in literature, but I think where the literature has slightly fallen down, and it's no criticism, it's just where we are in the stage of this technology, it doesn't offer much practical guidance about how you go about implementing measures in order to achieve these principles. And so we've seen a lot of window dressing from organizations saying they've got certain principles, but actually when you scratch underneath the surface, it's difficult to find much tangible work that's been done to implement them. And that's really what I think is changing, particularly over the last couple of years. So I mentioned explainability statements, for example. That's a tangible way of implementing this point about explainability and even transparency. I think fairness and discrimination is a huge issue that requires more technical measures, ensuring that the models are working as they should and arriving at the right decisions that they should, and more is being done in that field as well. But I think there's still a long way to go. It's interesting that if you look at, for example, the draft EU regulation on AI, you see those principles reflected in a number of provisions, and we are hopefully going to have standards in the next couple of years that give more of an indication as to how you implement those particular concepts. And I think we're in that stage now where we will get more practical information, and the focus will be on not just having those principles and pillars, but actually how effectively are you implementing them.
Sorry, I just have a quick, and just from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what it seemed is that we can't really achieve everything.
Yeah, So I'll put a bit of flesh on the bones in terms of people are probably listening to this thinking, why on earth has he talked about 9 pillars and not actually told us what they are? So I'll rattle through them. Yeah. So this is inspired actually by a framework that we saw published in October 22 by the Association of Computing Machinery. And it made sense for us to adopt this framework for a number of reasons. That they're the world's largest computing-focused association, world-renowned scholarly research. It's a collaborative effort between US and Europe in terms of technology policy committees. It's a really straightforward framework that we as a startup can adopt. And we think it lays the foundations for the harmonized standards to follow, which Minesh was touching upon. So these 9 are legitimacy and competency, minimizing harm, security and privacy, transparency, interpretability and explainability, maintainability, contestability and auditability, accountability, and then limiting environmental impacts. And there are a lot of words ending in the same letters there. But I think
do not make me recite them again, please.
I'm glad I wrote those down rather than now. For us, I think it's about startups just having a go, and we built this framework. We have a very clear list of actions underneath it now, and what's fascinating to me, to sort of Minesh's point there about actually implementing this stuff. And he talked about the compliance and risk areas. Once we wrote down all of the actions that we needed to self-police, because the regulation's not quite there, we're effectively writing this because it's the right thing to do, but we want to police ourselves. And we broke those down once we wrote down those actions, it's comms, marketing, data science teams, ML ops, automation, human in the loop. So the critical thing from my perspective about safety and ethics is it's a massive change management piece where you've got lots of very different skills, engineers, data scientists, commercial people, trying to audit themselves in a really complex, fast-moving area. So it's not perfect what we've done, but we're very proud that we're starting to customize and implement this framework at the organization level and at the product level, which is a product we've got coming later this year, which is a children's content and entertainment app. So I think in my previous life, I saw organizations say to me, we don't have all of the money for a research lab, so what should we do? And I think it is about trying to just take these frameworks and adopt them. But sorry, I got a little bit overly excited about my framework there. But
no. Oh, so do we, believe me, every day. But thank you for also mentioning, because I think it's really important to highlight when it comes to responsibility and accountability of implementing such things, the fact that you brought up the horizontals and also the verticals. So in a nutshell, everyone. There's no one.
Everyone has to be
person,
responsible.
yeah, or like exactly. And I think this is where the most overwhelming part is happening. How do you can build the pillars, you can do as many or as few as you want in any language that you want, but until it's something that is really internalized by everyone and becomes a mindset for me as a product builder, I think this is it's gonna be for some time the most interesting part. How do I embody all of these principles so that they become like any other aspect of product building? But yes, thank you so much for decomposing this. And now I would like to focus a little bit on what's happening in the regulatory environment at the moment. Short answer is a lot, but Minesh, I know you're in the depth of everything, and I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, what are some highlights that you've seen, or some triggering events in the regulatory space, and how are they going to affect the AI safety and ethics in the future?
Sure. Well, shall I start with a point, perhaps to clarify a misconception that is commonly held, which is that there is no AI regulation in force, or very little. But actually, it's important to say that there's a lot of existing regulation that can apply to AI development and use. So, for example, there is equality legislation that could play a part if there is AI causing discriminatory decisions or discriminatory impacts. There is data privacy legislation, of course, which we've seen have an impact, and we can come on to talk about ChatGPT, for example, and data privacy legislation. There's human rights legislation that's been invoked in cases relating to AI in terms of equality. So there is regulation in place. Other regulation is being amended so that it can apply to AI. So in the European Union, there is a very strong product liability regime that has been proposed to be amended to refer and cover expressly AI as a product. There was some doubt about whether it should or should not be considered a product, but it looks like that will go that way. And then we come to what I would call the AI-specific regulation. And it's true that we haven't got much of that. There are pockets of it in various jurisdictions, particularly at a state local level in the US. There are various examples of AI-specific regulation there, but I think we are on the cusp of seeing over the next 5 years, I would say, a huge volume of AI regulation coming down the line. I mean, just last week, I think it was, China published a draft generative AI law. I think we'll see other laws coming in to regulate generative AI in particular. But the big one is the EU AI Act. And I suspect we may see something in the States as well. There are a couple on the books, a couple have been proposed, but so far nothing more concrete than that in terms of federal regulation. But we are seeing a big change in the European Union through the draft EU AI Act, and that's probably going to come into force later this year or early next year, albeit it will then have a grace period of probably 2 years to allow companies to get up to speed. That is a very burdensome piece of regulation, and it also has significant penalties for non-compliance. You could, as an organization, be fined up to 6% of your global annual turnover for serious breaches of certain provisions. And the European Parliament is right now looking at how generative AI foundation models should be regulated under that particular act. So I think if we are doing this podcast in 3 or 4 years' time, we'll be talking about some very significant regulation in place that's probably going to be enforced in a very effective way. But at the moment, we're, I think, just looking at the starting gun for AI-specific regulation.
Thank you so much. This was incredibly helpful to get an overview of the landscape. And I have a follow-up question before we jump into something a little bit more practical. How are these laws, because you mentioned there's laws being amended, changed, and also like some new ones being introduced. How are they being changed? And what are your thoughts on this process? Just asking for me because I lack quite severely a legal background, and I like to understand more about this and your views on the approach.
No problem at all. I think it's the laws which are being changed are those where it's not quite clear how AI decision making is captured by them. So there are those laws that are general enough to apply to AI, so data privacy law, equalities law, for example. But then there are laws where it's not quite clear how AI should fall under it or does fall under it. So product liability is a good example. Product liability conventionally covers things that you would typically understand as products, machinery, goods that you buy, tangible things. Software has always been a bit of a battleground in terms of whether or not it's a product. So you have to actively make a change in order to say in that piece of law, an AI system will be considered a product. So it's those sorts of laws that we're seeing changes. But as I say, the big area is the AI specific regulation that I think is arguably going to become more important. But the challenge which you alluded to is how do you draft regulation which is effective, and that takes time to do, as we've seen with the European Union process, at the same time when the pace of development is just mind-blowing. I mean, Moore's law is going out the window when it comes to AI. We're almost, doubling the power and capability every few months of AI systems, at least at the current stage. So how do you draft effective regulation and bring it into force, but make sure that it's good enough to keep up with that pace of change? Significant challenge.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think the best way is to provide Callum's 9-pillar framework.
So
and that's definitely
some might argue it's stupid of me to talk about regulation after the global AI lead of a law firm has just talked about regulation, but I'm going to give it a go. Obviously, Minesh is an expert in this space, and I've been talking to him sort of on and off over the years about before generative AI was a thing, and I think I see it as this sort of really delicate balance that regulators have, where they don't want to be seen to encumber innovation and progress, but they have to protect society as well. And arguably, GDPR was quite unwieldy and complex, and it's noticeable that the UK are coming out with pro-innovation language around regulating AI, and I think another interesting analogy is gun control, where different countries have their own safety regulation and ethical beliefs on what the right thing is to do. So if we think about these large language models that are powering generative AI, foundation models, if they get into the wrong hands, bad things will happen. And an example is a chatbot convincing someone to do something illegal. So I think organizations like CHAPTR and anyone else out there developing generative AI, they have a very real responsibility to take their own ethical stance on the worst case scenarios when putting these large language models out into the world. And there's a lot of talk about the emerging generative AI tech stack. And I think as more organizations deeply understand this, they will realize there's lots of opportunities to build technology which could be seen as the, sorry for another analogy, but the bumper lanes at the bowling alley to guide these models in the right way. Because it's like, and really what we're talking about here is you have the model and you choose to build an app on top of it. ChatGPT is a very simplistic app, and there's a ton of complexity and decisions before you get to that point of launching the app as to how you put the safety guardrails in place. And I think this is what regulation is going to have to think through, is how do you go in and hold organizations to account, in because they're the ones that are choosing to put the generative content out into the world.
I think it's the perfect transition into the second to last part of this.
And I promise
this
I'm done with
which
analogies.
Is, okay, I really doubt that, but okay. Don't promise something you can't hold, okay? But Italy, right? Who kind of took a very interesting stance and said, "Hey, bye-bye, ChatGPT, until you can provide us with transparency, until you can protect children use, until you can allow the option for the users to manage the data that goes in and out." So very very direct, very. What do you think? Very how? What's your thought on this approach and the kind of precedent that I suppose Minesh it set? I hope I used that word correctly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, tell me your thoughts on this. I'm really curious.
I think I, like others, was a bit surprised at the decision. Typically, you would hope that a regulator would ask questions, conduct an investigation, and then decide if and what sanction is appropriate based on that investigation. So it felt like that the authority was slightly jumping the gun, and I think they've since tried to defend that, recognizing that it was perhaps a slightly surprising move, by saying that there is harm being capable of caused here, being risky here, and harm potentially to children as well and their data, which is obviously a sensitive issue, and protecting vulnerable categories of people is obviously vital. I think what they sort of said was, we think there's an issue here. It is likely to constitute a violation of data privacy legislation. So we think it's sensible to effectively put in place a moratorium on ChatGPT until OpenAI can demonstrate that either they're not in violation of the GDPR, or if they are, that they've put those guardrails, as Cal mentioned, in place around its use. I don't know if we'll see other data privacy authorities and other authorities doing something similar, sort of acting and then investigating. I think it's only fair that you ask an organization questions, you undertake the proper investigation, and then decide on what sanction is appropriate. But it did, I think, make us all realize that there are legal issues. There are going to be examples of enforcement like this. I think it probably gave reassurance to a lot of folk that there are regulators willing to take such snappy action in order to protect us. So I think it remains to be seen. We know there are other authorities looking at ChatGPT, so it'll be interesting to see what position they take. And also, of course, how OpenAI respond to this, and what guardrails and additional measures they put in place to protect around ChatGPT use.
Absolutely. It's an interesting one, right? Where Italy kind of bit the bullet, so to say, and now let's see if the others are gonna join the mission, or are just gonna wait until OpenAI improves their implementation and they're just gonna adopt it by default. It's gonna be a curious one.
Yeah.
But tell me, Callum.
I've got some observations.
You have an analogy. I know.
No analogy. What fascinates me about this one is they talked about this was the Italian Data Protection Authority, the large scale processing of personal data to train generative systems. So I think as this sector becomes more mature, we will see lots of organizations realizing that for competitive advantage and for them to build their defensive moat, they will need proprietary data to train narrow AI models, which are effectively a kind of fine-tuned and further trained versions of these foundation models. So that's just an observation of there'll be lots of other open AI competitors or just in general businesses that want to build generative AI systems looking at that, thinking about, okay, in what jurisdiction and in what way can we collect the data that we need to build our products. And the consensus, I think, seems to be exactly as Minesh said. It was slightly surprising, and I read an interesting article that talked about the lack of European coordination against this sort of, if Minesh referred to the EU AI Act earlier, does this become a bit of a fragmented model where countries go in different directions? And effectiveness and proportionality is interesting here. So there was a 400% surge in VPN downloads as a workaround to this. And the proportionality point was a blanket ban the right thing to do. And then I saw 2 days ago that they're going to reverse the decision as long as the service can be age gated for those 18 and above, and a national advertising campaign on radio, TV, and newspapers and the web telling Italy or Italian citizens what they've done. So we can all look forward to lots of interesting radio adverts about generative AI in the future, if that's anything.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was in the armory of penalties and sanctions available to data protection authorities. So that was the creative one. But look, I think broadly it's positive, isn't it, in that they've taken action, but they're not, as you say, it comes down to proportionality, but it's not a blanket ban. It's let's try and work together to work out how you can use this safely for citizens.
Yeah. Do you think, Minesh, a lot of this could have been proactively tackled if somehow OpenAI and the regulator had got together in advance? I read one article that just kind of said this seems to be, could have been tackled relatively easily with a bit of collaboration.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I think a lot of what needs to happen in this space is education. And I'm not saying that the regulator was uninformed, but we're all learning, aren't we, at the same time? Even developers are learning, often new features about their own models that they may not have appreciated were there. And so I think when you're thinking about education, it's really important to have all the relevant stakeholders involved in that dialogue process, because it's not just a defensive thing. It's not an educational piece in order to then prevent issues later on. It's about actually educating about all the positive things that I'm sure OpenAI have taken, all the measures they've taken to ensure safety as well. So it's about educating others and providing reassurance proactively, not just when you're on the end of a regulatory investigation. So yeah, I think more dialogue, more transparency, using that word again, can only be a good thing, really.
This is the perfect transition into our last section, which is going to be hot seat statements. In the interest of time, I'd really love to hear your thoughts on these two. And Minesh, I already touched upon this, but my statement to you that I'd love to hear how you feel about it is companies and regulators won't be able to coordinate to achieve ethical and safe development of AI, which is going to end in tragedy.
Yeah, quite a powerful statement. Look, we know that AI is capable of causing harm. You only need to look at the world of autonomous vehicles, where physical safety is on the sharp end of things going wrong in the AI world. So this is a consideration. It's an important one. I think this word safety is perhaps not used enough. So, I applaud CHAPTR for using that word, because when you take a step back and think about humanity, really safety is one of the most important considerations that we have to keep in mind. And as soon as a form of technology becomes unsafe, what much further discussion needs to happen? That is a wake-up call at that point, isn't it? When something becomes unsafe, it can be slightly undesirable, unpredictable. Those things can be mitigated, they can be worked out. But when we're talking about safety, that really should drive a lot of what's happening in this area. So I think, for me, safety is a good watchword to have when you're thinking about AI development and use.
Thank you. Hopefully, it's going to bring everyone together in a collaboration mode. And Callum, the one that I have for you, I think you're going to laugh very much, and then you're going to give a controversial answer. But it is better to deploy AI systems sooner rather than later.
Yeah, okay, good one. Well, I've only got 90 seconds, so I can't do too much damage. Look, on this one, I think there's definitely two schools of thought around how quickly we deploy these language models into the real world. And there was a case in Belgium where it has already led to tragedy. Someone very sadly took their own life following a conversation with a chatbot. So this is a very, very serious topic. And I think it's such a difficult one to get right in terms of the pursuit of human progress and innovation. And there'll be wonderful things that will happen off the back of these models in so many different sectors. And somehow we have to balance the fact that if bad actors put them out into the world recklessly without the guardrails, then it's exactly analogous to when we first introduced autonomous cars. There's in that pursuit of progress, there's going to be mistakes, and I think I'm certainly not envious of the regulators trying to kind of help these companies, and because you talked about like will the companies and regulators be able to engage. I philosophically am much more on a pause. Let's not put this out into the world until we really deeply understand it and have built all of the guardrails around it. But everyone's on a spectrum there, so I think it's a very important question. But I'm afraid I don't have a more detailed answer than that, because it will require years of debate and trial and error in sort of how we see how society reacts to these models. So pretty intense point to finish on, but obviously it's a serious matter. So organizations out there need to take it seriously.
Exactly. Thank you. And we need to give people a nugget to think about after listening. And if it's one thing, then this is it. And with this, we arrived at the end. Thank you so much to both of you for joining, for making it so easy to understand, for highlighting the seriousness of this topic, and for the honesty as well around where we are and what still needs to be done, which is of course a lot, but with the right pillars, the right mindset, and the right regulations in place, then this can definitely happen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
For being an amazing host, and thank you. Special thanks to Minesh for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And for everyone who listened, I hope you enjoyed it. We welcome any and all feedback, and see you in the next chapter.
Welcome to the next chapter.